Why would a crowned queen, in the dead of winter, choose to wear the same undergarments for months while her banners tightened around the last Moorish stronghold of Granada? The wind scrapes the canvas of the royal pavilion. A candle flickers over maps, sealed letters, and a silver crucifix. Within that wavering light sits Isabella of Castile, the woman who stakes her body as a pledge to the war. Her gown is neat, her gaze steady. Yet beneath the velvet lies a secret that the camp whispers about every night, the linen shift she has not changed since the campaign began. It is the winter of 1491, the final stretch before Granada's surrender, as the chroniclers record it. Smoke crawls along the tent lines. Frost crusts the ropes. Horses stamp and snort, and the air carries a sour mix of iron, wet wool, and human fatigue. Courtiers pull their cloaks tighter. Soldiers cross themselves as she passes, and even her enemies begin to measure her not only as a sovereign, but as a sign. The tale spreads that the queen has vowed before God to keep one garment until the city falls, a living emblem meant to stiffen spines and turn faith into motion. Endurance can sanctify a cause. It can also punish the flesh. Fabric hardens against skin, the body tires, and the face that smiles for the ranks grows paler with each week. In the cold silence between trumpet calls, a question gathers like mist above the riverbanks. When does devotion pass a threshold and become a hazard? And if the queen herself begins to falter, does this vow sow the first seeds of a health crisis that reaches beyond her tent and into the heart of a court? Stay with us as we sift legend from record and follow this vow to its last consequence. Watch to the end and subscribe to the Torture Throne so you never miss the darkest turns of royal history. Isabella of Castile did not arrive at that winter by accident. She was born in 1451, raised in a world where crowns were negotiated in dim corridors, where alliances could turn with a whisper. As a young woman, she learned that the strength of a ruler begins long before a coronation, in the habit of keeping a steady gaze when the room tries to shake it. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 turned two restless realms into a partnership. The union was not an easy romance. It was a pact with maps and treasuries and rival nobles watching for any slip. Yet it forged a single project that would outlast the doubts of courtiers and the friction of old borders. By the late 1580s, the project had narrowed to a single city. Granada rose pale and sharp against the Sierra Nevada, the last seat of the Nasrid dynasty and the last door that kept Christian Spain from completing the long reconquest. For generations, the peninsula had been a mosaic of faiths and crowns. What began as a series of contested frontiers had hardened into a final line. On one side, Christian banners waited with cannons and patient logistics. On the other, a proud court kept its rituals inside a walled splendor that had survived many campaigns and many kings. Isabella chose to be present. She moved with the army, looked into the faces of men who would bleed for the cause, asked for reports that spoke of bread, gunpowder, and hooves, not only of glory. She brought confessors and secretaries, but also officials who counted mules and measured grain. The siege of Granada was not a single thunderclap. It was a slow tightening of roads and rivers and morale. When an accidental fire destroyed parts of the royal camp in 1491, she ordered a permanent town to rise on the plain. It was named Santa Fe, Holy Faith, and it signaled that the rulers of Castile and Aragon had no intention of lifting the siege. In such a theater, a ruler's body becomes an instrument. Isabella understood the language of visible sacrifice. Medieval Catholic devotion taught that penance could bend suffering toward meaning, that the discipline of the flesh could call down favor. She had practiced austerity since youth. Confessors praised her attention to fasts and vigils. She had also learned that the crowd believes with its eyes as much as with its ears. A queen who shared cold and smoke with soldiers gave shape to a story that could pass from camp to town and from town to court. So the vow took root. Before God, she would keep a single garment next to her skin until the victory was sealed. It was an act of piety, a voluntary descent into discomfort offered as prayer. It was also an oath in a culture that treated oaths as foundations of law. To speak a vow and then break it would tear at the fabric that held authority together. She was not simply ruling by decree. She was proving that her word could mark her very body and that the mark would hold through time and weather. There was calculation in it, but not cynicism. Propaganda in this age did not run on news sheets and painted posters alone. It ran on the movement of mouths, on the short testimonies of men who had seen something with their own eyes. Messengers carried more than letters. They carried stories. The image of a sovereign who would surrender comfort for the fortune of the army moved faster than any sealed packet. Ambassadors wrote home with the same details that soldiers whispered by the fires. In foreign courts, the tale arrived as a curious note that blended devotion and iron will. In Spanish towns, it arrived as a spur. Give, pray, endure, for the queen endures as well. Behind the devotion stood politics that were larger than a single siege. Isabella and Ferdinand were not only closing a chapter of war, they were shaping a future where a unified crown could claim the peninsula as a single Christian realm. The fall of Granada would give them leverage with nobles who preferred old freedoms. It would strengthen their hand in Rome, and it would fix their image as the pair who ended a long story that had begun before either of them was born. For that image to hold, she needed symbols that ordinary hearts could grip. A town raised from ashes, a queen present among tents, a vow that stung the skin and fed the cause. Inside the pavilion, the vow altered routines that had once been effortless. Attendants learned to move with tact. Confessors guided prayer into the empty spaces that comfort had left behind. The linen hardened day by day, a private discipline that radiated outward into rumor and resolve. No decree could match the stubborn eloquence of that choice. It spoke to soldiers that their suffering joined hers. It told friends and rivals that the campaign would end only one way. The siege camp stretched like a restless city beneath the pale winter sun. Canvas tents sagged under the weight of frost in the mornings, and by midday, the thaw turned the ground into a churn of mud and trampled straw. The air was never still. Smoke from cooking fires hung low, mixing with the smell of damp wool, horse sweat, and the sour breath of men who had lived too long without the touch of clean water. Buckets of river water, drawn from streams already fouled by animals and refuse, sloshed dark and cold. It was enough for cooking, rarely enough for washing. Disease thrived in these conditions. Fleas and lice moved easily through bedrolls and cloaks. Soldiers scratched until their skin broke, and the raw patches became invitations for infection. The coughing of the sick was as constant as the ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Fever could carry off a man as swiftly as an arrow, and those who survived often returned to their duties with hollow eyes and trembling hands. In the center of this hard world, the royal pavilion did not escape the realities of the camp. The queen's tent was larger, its walls hung with fabrics that caught the candlelight. But the air inside was no cleaner than that outside. Every morning, Her attendants laid out the gown she would wear over the same linen shift. The fabric closest to her skin had lost the softness it once held. It had stiffened in places, creased with salt and sweat. The scent it carried was not hidden by perfumed water or the lavender pouches sometimes tucked into her sleeves. The toll on her body was slow but certain. It began with an itch along the seams of her underarms and at the nape of her neck. Tiny bites reddened her skin. Days later, the marks darkened, some swelling into tender sores. A court physician, allowed only the briefest examination, suspected the early stages of scabies or another mite-borne affliction. He spoke softly, suggesting that prolonged contact with the same garment could invite worse. Isabella listened, her expression steady, and returned to the table where military reports waited. For her attendants, the vow demanded both loyalty and quiet discomfort. Some whispered their concern in corners, out of her hearing. Others looked on with a kind of awe, as if each day she endured without complaint was another brick in the wall of victory. Soldiers who caught sight of her riding out to inspect the siege lines often spoke of the lines under her eyes, the paleness of her cheeks. Yet they also repeated her story with pride. In a world where kings and queens were often distant figures, here was a sovereign who bore the same cold, the same dirt, the same insects. There were moments when the strain showed. On one bitter morning, as frost still silvered the ground, an attendant noticed the queen's hands tremble as she laced her gown. On another, after returning from the siege works, she sat longer than usual before speaking, her gaze fixed on the brazier's small flame. These were glimpses, quickly masked, yet they traveled through the camp as stories do. Each telling seemed to harden the perception of her endurance. To the men who manned the towers of earth and timber outside Granada's walls, her discomfort became part of the campaign itself. The vow was never spoken of in her presence. It lived instead in the lowered voices of guards and servants, in the glances exchanged when the air in her tent grew heavy. It was a silent ritual, carried out day after day, that tied the fate of the siege to the body of the queen. In the mud and frost of the camp, her choice became more than a private devotion. It became a measure of the war's slow progress, and a reminder that victory, like endurance, was bought one uncomfortable day at a time. Winter deepened over the siege lines, and with it came the shadow no army wished to face. In the cramped lanes of the camp, disease moved faster than any messenger. The cold did not kill the fleas and lice that thrived in the seams of clothing and the folds of blankets. Typhus, carried by these tiny invaders, could sweep through tents in days. Fever rose, rashes bloomed across the skin, and the infected often drifted into delirium before the end. Dysentery claimed others, weakening them until even a small wound became a mortal threat. Physicians feared the reappearance of the plague, for in cities under siege, rats and their fleas found food among refuse and the dead. The queen's pavilion was no fortress against such dangers. Servants moved in and out, some coughing into their sleeves, others pale from sleepless nights caring for sick relatives in the camp. Water was too scarce to wash bedding with any regularity, and warm baths were out of the question. The vow she had made, so potent as a symbol, now also bound her to the same risks that stalked the poorest soldier. Close-fitting garments worn for months became a refuge for lice, and even the faintest scratch could become infected in these conditions. The court physician, in guarded words, hinted at the possibility of blood poisoning if the skin broke in the wrong place. Rumors began as low murmurs in the royal entourage. A lady-in-waiting claimed she saw the queen rise slowly one morning, wincing as she shifted her shoulders. A chamberlain confided to a friend that her complexion had turned sallow. Such whispers drifted beyond the pavilion. Traders bringing supplies to the camp carried the stories to nearby towns. There, in markets and churches, the tale of the Queen's vow took on darker tones. Some admired her as a saintly figure who shared the suffering of her people. Others feared that the act was inviting illness not only upon her, but upon the entire court. In Granada, the Nasrid defenders heard their own version. Spies and deserters carried news of the Castilian queen who refused to change her clothing. Some in the Moorish court saw it as a sign of divine madness, others as proof of unwavering faith. Either way, it gave their poets and preachers a story to tell the image of an enemy ruler punishing herself in the cold, waiting for a victory she might not live to see. Among the allies of Castile, reactions were more complex. Foreign envoys reported the story back to their monarchs, weighing admiration against concern. In Portugal and across the courts of Italy, it became a point of fascination. Was this the mark of a ruler whose will was as hard as steel, or of a sovereign blinded by the theater of her own devotion? The ambiguity only made the story travel faster. Within the siege camp, the soldiers took the tale in their own way. For some, it was a badge of pride, a living proof that their queen stood with them in every hardship. For others, it was a quiet worry. They had seen men struck down not by the sword, but by the slow rot of untreated illness. To lose a comrade was common. To lose a queen to the same unseen enemies would be unthinkable. Yet she gave no sign of relenting. When she rode along the lines, her back was straight, her eyes steady. The rumors could circle endlessly, but the woman at the center of them remained as unyielding as the siege itself. Dawn broke cold on the 2nd day of January, 1492. From the towers of the Alhambra, the banners of the Nasrid dynasty were lowered, their silks folding in the still air before being replaced with the standard of Castile and Aragon. Trumpets sounded from the Christian lines, a slow, deliberate music that rolled across the frost-covered plain. After 10 years of war, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain had surrendered. The gates of Granada opened, and the keys to the city were placed in the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella. Inside the royal pavilion, the moment carried a weight beyond ceremony. Servants moved quietly, carrying chests and folded cloth. For the first time in months, the queen would remove the linen shift that had bound her to her vow. The attendants worked with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Laces were untied. Fabric was lifted carefully from her shoulders. The undergarment, stiff from wear, was set aside without comment, as though speaking of it might diminish the gravity of the act. Warm water, scented faintly with herbs, was brought in copper basins. As steam curled upward, Isabella closed her eyes, her face unreadable, as the chill of months was eased from her skin. The change was not only physical. Courtiers who had watched her endure the vow now saw the return of ceremony and color to her presence. She emerged from the pavilion wearing fresh linen, a gown of deep crimson, and a mantle edged with gold. The soldiers along her path fell silent, some crossing themselves, others smiling with the relief that came from knowing their sovereign had kept her word to its end. In the eyes of many, this was not the end of a siege, but the sealing of a covenant between ruler and realm. That afternoon, Isabella entered Granada alongside Ferdinand, riding through streets lined with the subdued population of the conquered city. Chroniclers recorded her as calm and solemn, her gaze taking in the towers, gardens, and marble courtyards of the Alhambra. The vow had been fulfilled in the most public way possible, and the city itself became the stage for its conclusion. For her subjects, the victory was proof that the queen's endurance had drawn divine favor. For the defeated, it was a signal that the new ruler's authority rested not only on arms, but on a will that did not break. Politically, the surrender of Granada cemented the unification of Spain under Christian rule. It gave Ferdinand and Isabella a place in history as the monarchs who completed the Reconquista. The image of the queen keeping her vow until this exact moment became part of that narrative, a detail repeated in chronicles, sermons, and songs. In a world where symbols could shape the memory of a reign as much as laws or battles, this one was potent. The act also carried a message to the courts of Europe. Here was a sovereign who could match faith with discipline, who could endure hardship alongside her troops, and who could step into triumph without discarding the humility that had carried her there. It was a contrast to the image of distant monarchs who ruled from palaces, and it was noticed. Ambassadors wrote home with admiration, some with caution, all aware that they were witnessing a ruler who understood the theater of power as well as the mechanics of war. As the winter sun dipped behind the mountains, the queen's vow became part of the larger story of Granada's fall. The garment she had worn for those months was quietly taken away, its fate unrecorded, yet its presence lingered in every retelling of the siege. In the eyes of her allies, it was a relic of victory. In the minds of her enemies, it was a reminder that her resolve could not be bent by time, discomfort, or the slow weight of endurance. The story of Isabella's vow lives in a space between history and legend, where the lines blur just enough to let both truth and imagination breathe. Contemporary chronicles mention it sparingly, noting her presence at the siege and her deliberate choice to endure the same winter discomfort as her soldiers. These records, penned by court historians and clerics, carried a clear purpose. They were not only keeping a tally of events, they were shaping the image of a monarch whose endurance could be read as divine favor. Beyond the written page, the story wandered into the villages of Castile, carried by merchants, soldiers returning home, and priests with a taste for vivid detail in their sermons. Around hearth fires, it was told with soft wonder, each retelling adding a little more color. Some swore the linen was kept in a sealed chest as a relic. Others whispered that she fell gravely ill from her self-denial, only to recover on the very day Granada surrendered. The versions multiplied, bending to the beliefs of the listeners. For the devout, it became an act of holy sacrifice. For lovers of drama, it was a near martyrdom that blurred the line between sovereign and saint. Modern historians step more carefully. They weigh the vow as both a possible fact and a crafted symbol. They remind us that the late Middle Ages was an age of deliberate image-making. A single gesture, real or embellished, could carry across borders and outlast entire campaigns. Whether the vow unfolded exactly as the legend claims may be less important than the certainty with which it was believed. That belief, more than the garment itself, is what made the story endure. In the political climate of 15th century Spain, such a tale was worth as much as gold in the treasury. It painted Isabella not as a distant ruler behind palace walls, but as a figure who shared the dirt, the cold, and the risk. It strengthened loyalty among soldiers, reassured subjects, that God's blessing rested on the crown, and told foreign courts that this queen's power was built not only on armies, but on an iron will. Seen this way, the vow was more than devotion. It was a stroke of political genius, weaving faith and leadership into a single thread. It worked because it spoke to the heart of her time, to a people who saw suffering as the truest proof of sincerity. And in that shared vision, the woman in the frostbound pavilion became something larger than a monarch. She became a symbol that still stands, centuries after the siege fires of Granada burned to ash. The fall of Granada marked the closing of one chapter in Spain's long and fractured history, and in that moment, Isabella's name was carved into the stone of victory. For her supporters, she stood not only as the queen who united kingdoms and ended centuries of war, but also as the woman whose private sacrifice had become a public emblem. The image of her in the frostbound camp, holding fast to a vow few would dare, took root in the collective memory. It was retold in royal courts, in the streets of Castile, and in the distant halls of Europe where ambassadors painted her as a sovereign of rare resolve. This image became part of her legacy. It reinforced the idea of a ruler who would share the burdens of her people, a queen whose discipline was not an ornament, but a weapon. Granada's surrender gave her political leverage for reforms and strengthened the authority of the unified crown. Yet alongside the triumph came a quieter, more personal cost. Months of exposure to cold, poor air, and the constant irritation of unwashed fabric had left their mark. Though the chronicles rarely speak of it, her health bore the scars: skin ailments, lingering fatigue, and the toll of constant travel followed her in the years after the siege. For the court, the risks had been real. A serious illness could have destabilized the fragile balance of power during the war's final stages. In an age without modern medicine, an infection that began as a rash could spread to the blood, and an outbreak in the royal household could ripple outward through the entire camp. That danger had been held at bay, perhaps by luck as much as by faith, but it lingered as a reminder that symbols have flesh beneath them, and flesh is vulnerable. Still, the vow endured as a story worth telling. It outlived the siege, the reign, and even the queen herself. It passed into the language of legend, where truth is measured by the power to inspire rather than the precision of its details. Artists painted her wrapped in heavy cloaks under a dim winter light. Writers cast her as a figure of almost prophetic endurance. The garment itself vanished from record, but in the imagination of her people, it became as real as the keys of Granada. Isabella's choice was more than a personal act of devotion. It was a lesson in how power can be shaped through the body, through gestures that are felt as much as they are seen. She understood that rulers are remembered not only for the treaties they sign or the battles they win, but for the moments when they stand, unshaken, in the eyes of their people. In that sense, the vow was as much a part of her reign as the victory it was tied to. And yet, for all its grandeur, the story of the vow also carries a shadow. It asks us to consider the line between devotion and danger, between symbol and survival. It reminds us that the making of history is rarely clean, and that even the brightest triumphs can be edged with risk and pain. If you have followed Isabella's vow through frost, hardship, and triumph, you have seen how a single act can shape a legacy for centuries. But this is only one of many oaths, secrets, and acts of calculated extremity that have written the darker chapters of royal history. Stay with us, and we will take you beyond the veil of ceremony, into the moments where crowns weighed heavy, Choices cut deep, and the price of power was measured in blood, faith, and flesh. Subscribe to the torture throne and step into the stories that history tried to gild, but could never soften.